The booming steps echoed through the museum corridors. Pharaohs, emperors, and Mongolian war leaders all stood stock still as the terrified security guard ran between them. Roger Pascal swung his flashlight this way and that. The light glinted on the polished steel of ancient weaponry, muskets, scimitars, and cannons. Exhibit after exhibit flashed past him as he ran through the dark museum. There was no way it was real. No possible way. He was having a bad dream. That's all it was. A bad dream. The shaking ground under his feet and the marching rhythm of the impossibly heavy footsteps behind him told him that it was real, all right. It had just been a normal shift like any other, just a regular night at the museum. Roger had been sipping his coffee and listening to the radio when all of a sudden he felt his chair start rumbling beneath him. He put his coffee down on the table and watched as it recoiled as the footsteps grew louder and closer. He got up to investigate and couldn't believe what he'd walked in on. Skidding around the corner, he tumbled into a medieval suit of armor and sent it crashing across the floor. Chainmail helmet, gauntlets, all of it rattled and crashed to the marble floor, echoing all through the museum. Then there was a sudden deathly silence as the footsteps stopped. Roger didn't breathe. Then they started again, heading straight towards him. It was all Roger could do to lie on his back in front of the giant taxidermy eagle and point his flashlight at the door as the monstrous figure of the stone soldier walked around the corner, musket in hand. Woodstock, Vermont, 1995. It was a normal day just like any other. The birds were singing in the trees and there was a gentle breeze blowing through. Nothing at all out of the ordinary. Except, of course, the statue that opened its eyes. The Civil War Memorial had been a staple of Woodstock for well over 100 years. A plinth sitting in the middle of a park with a young soldier on top of it, holding a musket peacefully by his side. The statue had watched over the town generation after generation, except now its watching had become a little more active. It took several hours for anyone to notice. Dog walkers went past listening to their Walkmans. A banker sat on a bench opposite, deep in conversation on a giant brick phone. It was only when a young child running after her football looked up at the statue and saw it looking back at her that things changed. The girl's parents didn't listen to her, of course. Parents rarely do. But word quickly went around the girl's school. Most of the time, the statue was totally still. No movement in the eyes at all. But on occasion, when a group of kids gathered around it and talked to it enough, the statue seemed to look down at them as if it was listening. But that was it. No grown-ups were particularly interested in what the children were saying, and even a lot of the children who saw it went home, concluding that they must have been imagining things. So 6 months went by without anyone really paying the statue much attention. That was until it fired its gun. In a quiet rural town, everyone hears a gunshot, but for a long time no one could work out where it had come from. Police gathered around the park, searching all around where the weapon had been heard. The only clue they could find was a small hole in the wall of a shop across the street. A couple of officers joked that the shot must have come from the statue itself. Everyone laughed it off, except for a couple of the school kids who were playing nearby. Less than 2 weeks later, another shot rang out in the middle of the night, and a group of confused police officers rushed to the park to investigate what had happened. The only thing they found was a dead bird lying on the sidewalk, shot to death. Again, the jokes went around the department that it must have been the statue who did it. Except this time, the officers were all laughing a little less enthusiastically. Without much crime going on in Woodstock, Vermont, the department decided to take the shooting quite seriously, going so far as to perform an autopsy on the dead pigeon. But when they cut the animal open and looked at the wound inside its chest, they were filled with even more confusion than they were before. It wasn't a conventional bullet lodged into the bird's ribcage at all. It was perfectly round and made of what appeared to be stone. But the next shot that rang out from the memorial park was unmistakable. It was a weekend in the middle of the summer vacation, so the park was full of families all sitting around having picnics, barbecues, and staring up at the sky watching the birds circle lazily overhead. Bang! One of the pigeons exploded in a burst of feathers and plummeted out of the sky, landing on the sidewalk in front of the whole town. In shock, all of the townsfolk turned around to see the stone statue down on one knee with his musket on his shoulder. The statue looked down at all of them, surprised at the attention, then quickly got back to its feet and resumed its normal stance. Reports flooded all the local papers and news stations. The event was blamed on mass hysteria, a kind of group hallucination where everyone was somehow sharing the same story. But the number of people coming forward with the exact same account was irrefutable evidence. That's where the Foundation had to step in. In January 1996, containment procedures began, and the statue was given the designation SCP-011. Of course, a large contingent of agents suddenly appearing in a small town would raise a lot of suspicion, so the Foundation had to move very cautiously. One agent at a time, the Foundation established itself in Woodstock and began to study the statue day in and day out. By sitting on park benches, even looking through cutout holes in newspapers, and wearing fake outfits so as not to arouse suspicion. Steadily over time, the statue appeared to gain either a heightened mobility or just a renewed sense of confidence. While much of the time it did remain standing immobile, it would begin to occasionally stretch when it thought no one was looking and glance this way and that in apparent annoyance with the birds circling over its head. The shooting steadily grew more regular. Foundation agents observed several birds being picked out of the sky by the musket fire of SCP-011 over the following weeks. A clear pattern started to emerge. The statue would only fire at birds that seemed to be flying above it or getting too curious about it. In fact, the more fecal matter built up on the statue, the more aggressive it would be. Both in its body language and mood seemed to sour the dirtier it got. While there were initial concerns about the SCP potentially turning its rifle towards the local townspeople, these worries were largely dismissed as SCP-011 gradually started to build up a rapport with those around it. Before long, the caretakers of the park were having exchanges with the SCP. These exchanges started with the caretakers speaking directly to the SCP, and it nodding or subtly acknowledging the things they said. But over time, the interactions grew more and more personable. In the year 2000, SCP-011 spoke for the first time. It had just fired its rifle, picking off a pigeon from over 200 feet away, when a caretaker mildly exclaimed, "Nice shot!" The statue smiled, dipped his hat to the caretaker and said, "Thank you," in a gravelly voice. This marked a significant change in the Foundation's approach to the containment of SCP-011. Up until this point, the SCP was considered a broadly harmless member of the local town community. However, its ability to speak raised concerns as to this SCP's development. 4 years ago, it had been an immobile statue with nothing out of the ordinary to raise any suspicions among those around it. Where would its cognitive development end? Now that it had gained the ability to talk, groundskeepers and agents posing as groundskeepers struck up conversations with SCP-011 as often as possible. At first, these exchanges were brief, but over time, the SCP became steadily more vocal, until soon it was engaged in intellectual debates and sharing its views on the world with anyone who would listen. It was becoming clear that new containment measures were needed. In fact, SCP-011 soon lost interest in shooting birds. Or rather, the SCP was persuaded to stop shooting birds. While the prospect of having animals defecate on it still appeared to anger the statue, the Foundation was able to explain through ideological grounds why shooting birds was a disproportionate response relative to the minor harm they were doing to it. Keen to engage in philosophical and ethical discussions, the statue was very open to hearing the Foundation's viewpoint on the issue, and having sufficiently considered all sides of the debate, decided that it would, in fact, be better for the well-being of all involved if it stopped shooting the birds from the sky. In return, the caretakers and Foundation agents promised to do their best to clean it regularly and keep the animals at bay. But with word of this bizarre tourist attraction steadily gathering momentum as the age of email began to take off, the Foundation decided that it would be best to relocate SCP-011 entirely. However, agents who had been living in Woodstock for the prior 4 years were hesitant to relocate the entity to a test chamber or storage facility. The benefits that it had brought to the local community far outweighed the risks and threats that it posed. The statue had become a local celebrity, smiling and waving at children who went past. and even offering brief history lessons to any confused tourists who found themselves wandering through the park. Most just assumed it was a person in gray paint. It was Agent Khan who came up with the idea of relocating SCP-011 to a museum. Being kept indoors, away from the dangers of any fecal bombing runs, was the main priority. Khan argued that within a museum, the statue would blend in seamlessly with the exhibits around it. Furthermore, if anyone did see the statue move or talk, they would assume that it was an interactive exhibit and treated as such. Having shown a real love for academia, history, and debate, Khan believed that SCP-011 would benefit greatly from being in such a setting, both learning and eventually even teaching about the history of the American Civil War. However, when all these arguments were put forward to the statue itself, it was hesitant. Having spent the entirety of its cognitive existence standing on the same plinth, shooting at the same pigeons, the idea of relocating to somewhere new and unknown was very intimidating. Even with the soldier's mindset, SCP-011 was still feeling incredibly nervous about the idea of moving house. Agent Khan and SCP-011 found themselves locked in a stalemate. Try as she might, convincing the SCP to leave its current home was like talking to a brick wall, or rather, a stone wall. The pair of them ended up dropping the conversation for a couple years, focused instead on psychiatric evaluations and history lessons for the SCP. In 2002, the Foundation officially declared that SCP-011 had achieved sentience with a great enough level of self-awareness to pass as a normal human being, aside from the fact that it was composed entirely of stone. For 2 years, Agent Khan talked to SCP-011 every day on the park bench. The slats on the bench had to be replaced several times as the weight of the statue broke through them, snapping them clean in half on several occasions. During this period, the pair of them built up a rapport rarely seen between humans and SCPs. So much so that in 2004, Agent Khan managed to convince SCP-011 to move to a local museum on one condition: she would go as well. The Foundation agreed to the terms, deciding that Khan could take on the role of being a researcher in the museum. That way, she could keep an eye on SCP-011 and report any activities, while the Foundation officially relinquished control over the SCP. What happened next was perhaps rather predictable, or at least it would be predictable to anyone who had worked with Agent Khan and SCP-011 during that time in Vermont. As the pair of them moved into their new lives at the museum, romantic feelings blossomed between them. Seeing as SCP-011 is officially outside of the SCP Foundation's jurisdiction, there has been no official inquiry into the nature and practicalities of the relationship between the woman and the statue. But from the reports that make their way to the Foundation every 3 months, it is clear that both are very much enjoying the privacy of their new arrangement. Roger Pascal closed his eyes, imagining the barrel raising higher and higher until it was pointed squarely at his face. He had been told by his bosses not to ask questions about the origins of the statue that had suddenly appeared in the Civil War section. Even when he saw the statue's eyes moving, he'd kept his mouth shut. That was until he was doing his security rounds that night and heard those booming footsteps leading him behind one of the displays. He had rushed over in a panic. Peering around the corner, he had been shocked to see Miss Khan, one of the researchers here, and the Civil War statue engaged in a passionate kiss. He had turned and bolted as fast as he could until he ended up here, terrified on the floor as he imagined the musket being leveled at him. But then a second pair of footsteps joined the group, and a woman's laugh filled the room. Opening his eyes, the security guard saw the pair of them, the statue and the researcher standing in the doorway, laughing about the whole situation. The musket was slung over the man's shoulder as he offered a cold, stony hand down to the security guard to help him up. Ironically, there was something about the statue's smile that softened Roger's stony heart as he was hauled to his feet. I have so many questions. Now check out SCP-173 Origin Story, How 173 Got to Site-19, and SCP-1913 Deadly Monster Squad, The Furies.